All right, we're up live now for episode 5 of the Men's Voices Ireland podcast. This time, gender studies. So, I don't think this topic needs much of an introduction, but for those who are not familiar with what gender studies is, it is essentially the quasi-academic look at the gender relationship between men and women in society from an ideological perspective, masquerading as a science. And now that the well has been sufficiently poisoned, David, I'm sure you have a lot to say about this topic, given that it was you who requested that we do this particular subject for the podcast.
Right, James. Right. I do have strong feelings about it because it's one of those areas that has contributed in recent times to a decline in intellectual life in the universities in particular, and in general, I would say as well, and in a kind of a contempt for the values of truth, evidence, and logic.
Yeah.
It's not just confined to women and gender studies, indeed, but it has spread to other areas of academia, but it's particularly prevalent in this particular area. First of all, I would say that women's studies started back in the early 70s in the US in particular, but we now have departments of gender studies, and it seems to me that what has happened is there has been a cosmetic name change.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, sort of departments that were, at one time called women's studies have now called themselves gender studies, but there's no difference between them.
No, in fact, we have some very interesting statistics on hand, which we obtained from one of our members contacting the head of gender studies at Trinity College Dublin, which is, Ireland's premier university, in last year. So this isn't from years ago. And what I can see here from the statistics is that it is, as you say, just a cosmetic name change, and it is basically still women's studies masquerading as gender studies. So we have a reading list of 255 books, on which 98 to 99% are by female authors. We have 11 out of 255 books talking about issues relating to masculinities in men and the men's movement, and actually no books about the men's movement, even though in the last 10 to 20 years is when that movement has actually built up a lot of steam. So you have a department calling itself gender studies, in which almost 100% of the reading material is female authored, and almost all of the student dissertations written for the department are female authored. So I think you're absolutely right, David, to say that it is just attempting to look like it's all encompassing the gender debate, when really it's just the same old shtick. So go on.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you look at the composition of the staff in those departments, it will show you too, there's overwhelmingly staffed by women as well.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. The thing is that no other academic program has leaned so heavily and so constructively and so inventively on social constructionism as women's studies. It's the theoretical bedrock of the current wave of feminism.
Yeah. Could you explain what that is for our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with the idea of social constructionism?
Yeah. The idea of social constructionism, well, we derive our characteristics as men and women from basically two ways. Biology contributes naturally,
of course,
to how we grow and evolve as men and women, and the feeling is that it contributes at least 50%. The other area then, of course, is the social environment in which we live, the socio-cultural environment in which we live, and that contributes a certain amount as well to how we develop and how we think, and the kind of thoughts that we grow up with. But the women's studies holds that gender is entirely socially constructed. It has nothing to do. It has nothing to do with biology. It is purely a social construct. In other words, that boys and girls enter the world, babies as blank slates, and everything that determines how they evolve, either men or women, is learned from the environment. And it's extraordinary because it ignores entirely the fact that men and boys and babies do have actually genitals which distinguish them as boys and girls, and they simply ignore that. It's quite
and the effects of hormones and so on brain development and
exactly hormone development is another, brain development is another. These things have been shown to evolve differently in men and women, and these are entirely happen outside the social construction area. They happen naturally, but this is entirely ignored. I would go on to say that the author, the well-known psychologist Steven Pinker, has said that he calls what he calls gender feminism is the stuff that is generally taught in women's studies courses and in gender studies courses. Gender feminism is his term for it, and he says that it holds for about 3 claims about human nature. And the first is, as I've said already, that the differences between men and women have nothing to do with biology, but are socially constructed entirely. He says the second is that humans possess a single social motive, which is power, and that social life can be understood only in terms of how power is exercised.
Yeah.
And the third goes even further. He says that human interactions arise not from the motives of people dealing with each other as individuals, but from the motives of groups dealing with other groups. So in this case,
it's quite Marxist, right?
It's Marxist, yeah. It's this case
collectivist.
Yeah, it's very collectivist. In this case, it's the female gender and the male gender, and of course, the notion is that the male gender is oppressing the female gender, and all women are encouraged to identify themselves as belonging to a gender. And again, this links up with the notion of identity politics, which is another another mainstay of gender studies, and it encourages people from different classes and ethnic groups and so on to identify themselves not as individuals but as members of so-called oppressed groups.
Yeah, the intersection of their various identities, it being the most important factor in how you treat them and how they expect to be treated. So if you are from multiple oppressed classes simultaneously, then you deserve to be at the top of what is called the progressive stack. So, if you may have seen at the recent marches in Washington where there were a lot of infighting about, the black women need to be at the front and the white women behind because, yes, they're both women, so they're both oppressed on that front, but the black women are also being oppressed in terms of race, so they get an extra boost, so to speak. And then the LGBT black women are even in front of the black women, and the disabled LGBT black women are in front of the LGBT black women. It's exactly. Absurd.
It's extraordinary, and this gives rise to conflict, of course, among these groups, because there's some of them have a greater claim to victimhood than others. And they even go so far as to claim that the black women, so on, go so far as to claim that the white women are actually they are socially favored, you like.
Oh yeah, I mean that's the origins of the feminist movement, right? It's middle to upper class white women in America who actually were surprisingly uncaring about what was going on with the riffraff.
That's right.
Be they male or female. And those origins are actually rather embarrassing to the modern Marxist feminist types, and that is why they're preoccupied with this idea of intersectionality. I think it's actually white guilt sort of injected into, if you like, feminism. And that's also why the recent women's marches in America were being headed by known Sharia proponents, Islamists.
That's right.
It's quite extraordinary to see that happening, but it's all because of the effect that identity politics has and in particular the sort of fetishization, sorry, I mispronounced that, fetishization of oppression and victimhood and turning it into power.
That's right.
I think we've seen that a lot these days, that the person with the highest score in the victimhood scale is using it as a source of leverage and influence over others, you know.
That's right.
You don't have a right to speak about this because you don't understand the struggle and so on.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And it leads to an enormous divisiveness. I mean, first of all, I mean, gender studies in itself creates a huge division anyway, as between men and women, because it names women as an oppressed class and men as the oppressors. That's one.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But the other division is, as you say, is the division within the so-called oppressed classes themselves, but whereby some claim to have a higher claim to victimhood than others, and to claim a higher grade, if you like, in the oppression stakes. But just go back to the gender constructionism. I mean, the claim that the gender is socially constructed in its entirety is false, and it has been proven false by science over quite a good many years, or maybe the last 30, 40 years, perhaps, with the growth of cognitive science, neuroscience, genetic behaviorism, and other newly developing science, and they have shown that there is no basis to this at all, and that I've said that the contribution to one's gender arising from biology is at least 50%. So this means that when gender studies in particular, you know, has a kind of a hostility and a contempt for science, because it knows that science doesn't support its claims, and this has been borne out in the ongoing debates that have been going on, this hostility towards science.
Yeah, the term they have for people who use neuroscience in any way to imply differences between the sexes is neurosexism. That's what
Is
the
that
word they
right?
use. That's right. There was a
I
talk
didn't.
in Trinity a couple of months ago from a scientist who was giving a talk on exactly this, done through actually women in science programs. So it's actually an affront to science, saying that, you know, even studying this area is perpetuating neurosexism. And indeed, there was a science paper. So, you know, science, for those who don't know, is a very prestigious journal, which was arguing, you know, that there's no difference between the male and female brain. And their argument was that because, you know, female brains have male-looking traits and some male-looking traits or brains have female-looking traits, therefore, you know, the gender constructionism is true.
Yeah.
And it's been, you know, there's multiple replies pointing to huge aggregate differences on average between the brains that were kind of conveniently either ignored or kind of disregarded in the paper. And nonetheless, this was published. You know, the idea that there's no difference, it's coming from a position of ideology, and what they really want to do is make it sort of an untouchable subject, in the same way that, you know, they want it to be viewed in the same way that phrenology was in the early 20th century.
Right.
This bunk science that was used to justify racism by examining skulls.
Yeah.
That's what they want to categorize looking at sex differences in the brain as, because it's very inconvenient to the narrative if there's a condition like congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which affects girls and basically involves them getting exposed to large amounts of testosterone during development.
Mm-hmm.
And the babies actually display far more, stereotypically male traits in terms of their behavior and their interests. So, for example, they're more likely to want to play with little mechanical toys than cradle dolls, and might be quite tomboyish.
Yeah.
I think I'm not 100% sure, but I think there might even be a link to sexuality. They might actually be gay as well, purely from, you know, hormonal exposure, which affects the brain development. So if that's true, basically all of gender studies the core ideology is, you know, false. They cannot both simultaneously be true. So it's using politics and sort of pressure and ostracization and bullying tactics to attempt to keep the narrative chugging along, is what I would call it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, there have been these cases where, where these so-called gender theorists have advocated that boys who lack testicles, who are born that way, but boys, but somehow have damaged testicles or lost them in accidents, so forth, that they be raised as girls and that they will behave as girls. But this is shown to be false.
That is actually, yeah, there's actually a very good book about this kind of subject called Galileo's Middle Finger, which I read recently. And one of the areas of the book was about this exact kind of thing, pushing an ideology in science. So it was all about scientists who found out things that were inconvenient to some narrative or some group of people. And as a result, they were attacked in a very kind of vicious and underhanded way. One of the topics was to do with sort of gender identity, transgenderism, and this kind of thing. And the scientist who was being ostracized because he was saying things that the community didn't like. There was, to my understanding, quite a lot of scientific merit to what he was saying. Not that it was perfect, but that's not how science works. But nonetheless, they did not like what his findings were doing to the movement. So I think people should definitely have a read of that book, because it shows that, you know, hostility towards science isn't just, you know, people tend to think of rednecks in America who, the Bible is my science, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
No, the left wing is just as bad, and in fact, in many ways, much worse, because they are sort of winning the culture war, or they have won the culture war over the last 20 years against the religious right. And people tend to think that they're the good guys.
Yeah.
And that they're in favor of science and that they're all about truth and reason. I really don't think they are.
No. And to go back to what you said a moment ago about science and the way science has tended to contradict the claims of the gender studies theorists and so on, I don't know of any major scientist who backs those claims. I know of several who, quite a few who refute them. I mean, I can think of Richard Dawkins has made YouTube videos, I believe, in which he's come out strongly against gender studies.
Jordan Peterson, of course, the famous Jordan Peterson. Professor Gad Saad, also from Canadian University, he's an evolutionary psychologist, so he's very much antithetical to these people.
Right.
So yeah.
There is, and I believe Noam Chomsky, who is a noted left winger and radical, political
and
radical,
anarchist, in fact,
anarchist. He too has no time for gender studies.
Yeah, and if Noam Chomsky doesn't have time for it, you really know you're in deep.
You're in deep trouble.
Big trouble.
Yeah, and I don't know of any scientists. I mean, the number of these things have been refuted these ideas have been refuted in a number of science books, major works by scientists, and nobody from the other side has come out to argue the case, and nobody with any decent arguments come out to argue the case. So there it is. But just to sum up what we said about the fundamental, the basic fundamentals of gender studies, we said that certain themes are basics: gender, social constructionism, the notion of being oppressed. Oppression is basic idea, and the biased nature of science and knowledge generally. These are all part of the basic ideology of gender studies. And the thing is, they are sacrosanct. They cannot be questioned. The nature of the subject is that it's a closed book. If you dare to question any of these dogmas, then you are outside the the fold. You're banished from the fold.
Absolutely, yeah.
And this is why it's so anti-intellectual. You know, true academic studies are about questioning everything, and everything is open. Nothing is taken as sacrosanct. Every idea is open to question. Oh, and the nature of science, the way it progresses, is that it progresses by questioning, by looking at reforming the ideas if they need a reform, and putting forward changes to the hypotheses, and then testing those in their turn. And this is science is self-correcting in this respect. It continues to self-correct itself. It's not perfect, of course, but it is reliable in the sense that it produces reliable knowledge, as we know. Women's studies, gender studies, it's deeply ideological, and it has been compared to other fundamentalisms, such as religious fundamentalism.
Oh, I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, it is quasi-religious, at least in the sense that it has actually fulfills a lot of the characteristics of a religion, doesn't it?
It does.
It has core beliefs, which are articles of faith, rather than rigorously proven facts about the universe. And it also has, it has heaven and hell. So hell being the patriarchy and heaven being some sort of, idyllic utopian future with, I guess, no gender, or the toxic elements of masculinity are finally defeated.
Perhaps, yes.
It's rather creepy and ideological.
It is, yes, and then I suppose this brings us into the politics sphere, because as we've just been saying, gender studies is not about academic inquiry, about the search for truth, as other academic disciplines are. It's based on ideology, and it's not open to question. It's a closed system.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, and therefore, then the way it continues and develops is by spreading this ideology, and the way to do that is by invading politics, and by taking part in political activism. And women's studies and gender studies are hugely into political activism, and they believe that they have a right to evangelize students, to indoctrinate them, so to speak, in these ideas. The students are not allowed to question this. If they do question it seriously, they I suppose they're shown the door. I guess that's what happens. But yes, this is toxic to academic freedom. This kind of thing is toxic to academic freedom. It destroys academic freedom. When disciplines are allowed to develop in universities, whereby basic ideas are not open to question, then this destroys academic freedom. And this is one of the problems with the universities today. This is happening on such a wide scale.
It's troubling when you see the generations of people who've been propagandized, because some of them will go into university academia themselves to keep that cycle going. But what actually happens is a lot of them go out into the likes of media, politics, activism in public life, and they kind of spread their tendrils throughout society. So it sounds almost like tinfoil hat conspiratorial, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that the reason there's been such a huge shift towards this mainstreamization of this ideology is because they've built it up slowly over decades. I believe it was Christina Hoff Sommers and Camille Paglia, two, I guess you could call them feminist renegades, equity feminists. I don't know what word they would use.
Yeah, equity feminists, I think would be.
I think equity feminists would be the word they would use. And for those who don't know, it basically just means not what we were just talking about, but still in favor of, girl power and all that kind of thing. What people kind of tend to think feminism is, if they're not really that invested, they kind of just think, yeah, it's about empowerment and you can do anything a man can do. That's the kind of thing that Christina Hoff Sommers would probably espouse, but she's very much against the ideology underlying academic feminism at the moment. But anyway, the point is that she mentioned that in the 90s, her side won the argument, as in they were winning the public debate. But in the meantime, the other side quietly took up the university chairs. They quietly got into the hierarchy in academia, getting research grants and writing books and papers and indoctrinating generations of students. So in a way, it's almost like a subversion of academic freedoms, in the same way that sort of fascists often use the tools of democracy to undermine it from within. These people use the freedoms granted in theory to professors and academics, freedom to inquire, freedom to propose any idea and have it discussed, to kind of close ranks, gain power, and then once they have power, start dictating what is and isn't acceptable discourse. So, as we were saying earlier, when 99% of your output is written by one gender from one perspective, you're not a discipline.
That's right.
I mean, it would be like the equivalent of if you look in any science, you're going to find competing theories on something. If in biology, people who believed in, I don't know, group selection versus people who believed in natural selection of individuals, if every paper was being written by only one side, you would start to wonder, what's going on there. I thought there were competing theories. I'm not saying that those are two valid theories with equal footing, by the way, but I'm just saying if one side was not writing anything or not being represented, you'd start to wonder why. And it's very unlikely that it's going to be because of scientific merit. It's going to be more likely because of politics.
Right.
And that's what this is all about. It's not about academia. It is about politics.
That's right. And this has been verified by quite a number of academics, many of them women, actually, respected women academics have remarked on this. And one of them, Daphne Patai from the University of Massachusetts, has criticized this aspects of the women's studies programs, arguing that they place politics over education, and that the strategies of faculty members in these programs have included policing insensitive language, championing research methods which are supposed to be congenial to women, such as qualitative over quantitative methods, and conducting classes as if they were therapy sessions.
Yes, that was a very common problem. This whole safe space, feeling circle type thing is actually emanating from, it is not just women's studies, but kind of social justice, activism type classes as well.
That's right. That's right. You're encouraged to speak up about your problems, and it's like a therapy class. You supposedly purge yourself of the ideas that have been infecting you or affecting you. But Patai then quotes one of the favorite slogans of the gender studies people, and that is that the personal is the political.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and that students can get academic credit for doing internships or performing community service in feminist agencies, and this is used quite widely to spread the political message. I'd like to quote from another well-known female academic, Mary Lefkowitz, who is a classics professor at Wellesley University, and she says that a still larger problem is the degree to which politics has infected women's studies scholarship. She says, feminist theory guarantees that researchers will discover male bias and oppression in every civilization and time. It's a guarantee. And, it's frightening to think that this stuff is being written and it's being regarded, as fact and taken as truth.
Well, it's just basically one gigantic exercise in confirmation bias.
Exactly.
If you come at it with an ideological position to start with, and you need to be sort of indoctrinated into it, you will see it everywhere. Right?
That's right.
There's a quote from a sort of now notorious, famous modern feminist by the name of Anita Sarkeesian, who got a lot of flack because her strategy was basically to point out how sexist media is. So she's a media critic,
Yeah.
and that's kind of superficial and kind of vacuous. I'm not really going to focus on that, but I will focus on, there was a talk she gave in Sydney a couple of years ago, and in that talk, she basically mentions that, you know, when she went to university, it's all of the racism and sexism around you until you're taught to see things in terms of systems. So you think in terms of systems of oppression, systems of intersecting systems of power that are in society to concentrate power with men, and then especially with white people, and then they intersect to give the most power to white men. And she's basically saying, until I went to university, I didn't see this. And
Yeah.
she's talking about it as though it's like, I was educated
Yeah.
and then I saw the truth. But what actually happened was the reverse. She went in with just a blank, regular, probably inquiring enough mind that was just seeing the world as it was, which is a complicated mess of many different things. And then she was basically indoctrinated, propagandized to, until she saw things the way her professors wanted her to see them.
That's right. That's right. The the subject of gender studies has been associated with a number of other of these exotic disciplines which have grown up in academia in the last 50 or 60 years. To mention post-structuralism, which I believe, I haven't studied it in any detail, but it's supposed to be close to postmodernism. But according to another female academic who actually did followed quite a number of women's studies courses in different universities, she has a very strong comment to make. She says, perhaps the most troubling influence on women's studies in the past decade has been the collection of theories known as post-structuralism, which essentially implies that all texts are arbitrary, all knowledge is biased, all standards are illegitimate, and all morality is subjective, which is quite a handful. It says all texts are arbitrary, so no text is good as another. Which allows them to sort of to talk about the canon of great literature as being hopelessly biased by male values. So they don't study, in particular, don't study Shakespeare or other great dramatists or other great writers. And then they claim that all knowledge is biased. This again refers to science. You know, that science is not a basis of true or reliable knowledge. That it's biased, and standards are legitimate. There are no standards. It's quite extraordinary that this kind of thing, that they kind of claim this kind of thing, but but they do contradict themselves as well, because they, if all standards are relative, they continue to claim that for feminists, some things are objectively wrong. In other words, the patriarchy is the great evil, you know?
Yeah, of course.
And the patriarchy is great evil, and this is the great wrong that they're struggling against. But how do they know this? Morality is all subjective, you know? And yet there is this objective evil called patriarchy. You know, it just doesn't make sense. But it's a part of the problem is that they have never engaged in a dialogue with other scholars across the disciplines. As I said, they will not engage with scientists because the scientists would destroy them. But they will not engage with other social scientists. In particular, they will not engage with philosophers, because if they did, they would have to examine their basic ideas, their basic the foundations of their beliefs. And again, they would be brought face to face with the inconsistencies and in fact the contradictions which exist there, and they don't want to do that either. So they don't engage with other scholars. Instead, what they do is they in their papers that they cite each other. It's a kind of a mutual backslapping operation that goes on between themselves. So it has no value. It's all, as you say, adds to this confirmation bias, which is rife in this area.
Yeah, well, citing sympathetic voices and so on is already a problem in real science.
Yep.
In particular, citing yourself or your friends in a little, backslapping circle, as you put it. So if you put it into something that's basically what that means is it's very easy to lend legitimacy to something if you have 100 citations to someone else saying it before you.
Yeah.
No matter how ridiculous it is. So even sometimes in my own work doing scientific research, you read a paper and has a citation to something that they claim, you kind of feel that's a bit weird, it doesn't sound right. You go check the paper and it doesn't really support what they were saying, or maybe it does a bit, but because it's been reduced to a citation, many people will just kind of assume it must be right. And that's a problem in, as I said, real science. So you can imagine when you put it into this kind of discipline, which is already on shaky footing to begin with, it's a very good way to prop up and give a veneer of legitimacy to almost anything.
Right.
And yeah, that is, I think, one of the really strong reasons why, for example, views on domestic violence being the way they would like to view it, which is universally male created phenomenon. This was, I think his name was Strauss,
Murray Strauss.
Yeah, Murray Strauss has written a lot of papers about it. One of the things he said about that's causing huge issues is this exact thing.
It's like
everyone's starting a citation circle, which might even lead nowhere. So you go to the very final citation and it doesn't even support the claim, or it just states the claim without proving it. But then once it's published and it's quote unquote peer reviewed, then you can have people saying, this is peer reviewed literature.
It's right. It has done things in common with what are called post facts in today's parlance. The same thing. You quote other sources and you trace the chain back, but there's nothing to support the earlier sources, the first sources at all. Nothing whatsoever. And once the things are repeated, once the ideas are repeated often enough, they attain the status of being facts. And this is a great problem. If we want to say something about women's studies and science, the gender studies people, they claim a great number of things are socially constructed. It's not just gender, science is socially constructed.
Oh, it needs to be decolonized and so on.
That's right.
Because it's actually the white male, supremacy tool.
That's right.
Apparently, the tool where
even so,
Curie wins 2 Nobel Prizes, for being a genius. That's the white male tool. Yeah. It beggars belief.
Yeah, knowledge is socially constructed. Truth, you can go on and on. Truth, socially constructed. And it simply, you're peering into an abyss once you come. Reason apparently is socially constructed as well. So, everything, the ground under your feet vanishes once you start delving into this stuff entirely, and eventually it's like relativism, the ground disappears, but you're still talking in the void, and nobody can hear you because every way of understanding and every means we have of communicating with each other has been taken away. It's extraordinary. But one of the things that has been said, but I have read a book by 2 scientists. Gross and Levitt wrote a book called Higher Superstition, which it talks about the academic left and its quarrels with science. And he says that in relation to the notion that science is socially constructed, he says that this point of view, rigorously applied, leaves no ground whatsoever for distinguishing reliable knowledge from superstition. And this is why they term their book Higher Superstition. And they go on to say that this is what's going on in universities these days, and it's being supported by the state. Universities are supporting this kind of nonsense, these kind of departments. There are, according to last figure I had, there were something like 900 gender studies departments. Is that the figure you have heard?
You mean in this country? I mean
No,
in
I think
general.
I don't know whether it's worldwide or whether it's just in the Western world, but it's something in that order. Perhaps 900 worldwide gender
That's
studies.
extraordinary.
Yeah, and
Oh, departments. Sorry. I actually I don't know why. Maybe my brain isn't working. I understood professors
no department,
and
as I understand it.
worse.
Yeah, yeah,
There's probably a lot
and
more than that in professors than if there's
yeah,
900 departments.
that's right. And these two scientists, Gross and Levitt, have taken up some of the false claims, comments on science by feminists as well as by the proponents of multicultural studies and postmodernism and other isms, and they have done it in this book, and it's quite extraordinary some of the things that they've come out with. I came up with a few choice quotes from certain luminaries in women's studies. One of them is Sandra Harding. She has described Newton's work, Principia Mathematica, as a rape manual.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
This is the kind of thing that the SoCal affair
that's
exposed,
right.
though.
That's right.
So
Yes, this is an extraordinary thing. I think people should be more aware of this. Alan Sokal, who is a physicist at New York University, and who is well versed in the kind of jargon that is used by the postmodernists as well as the gender feminists and the gender studies people. And he is actually, he describes himself as a leftist anyway, but back in 1996, he decided to write a hoax article. And I don't remember the title now.
it was, I think, wasn't he concluding that gravity is a social construct or something like
something
that, or that it's
like that.
sexist, something hilarious like that,
Something
yeah.
hilarious. Yeah. The hermeneutics of transgressing boundaries was part of it. And the hermeneutics of gravity, something extraordinary. And he wrote it. He did. He said something like you were saying, that gravity wasn't the kind of thing that physicists normally understood it to be, but he couched it in this kind of impenetrable jargon. It's quite extraordinary to look at it. The normal individual looking at this would be turned away completely by the kind of jargon. But he wrote it anyway, and coming from somebody with a science background, it was accepted by the journal Social Text, which is a major journal in, I suppose you call it, postmodernist studies.
Yeah,
it was accepted. And 3 weeks later, Sokal came out and he wrote to the New York Times, and he said, "This is all a hoax. I just made up this stuff." And there was consternation for a while.
but they also said, I believe, I remember reading about this a while ago, so it's been a while. Apologies if my memory is incorrect, but I think they actually said, well, even if it's a hoax, it still contains a lot of valuable insight. So, like, this is a level of discourse we're talking about here, where somebody who intentionally writes a lot of bunk for a joke,
Yeah,
they'll still kind of defend it as, well, it's well written junk.
yeah. They did. I mean, they made several of these academics on that side made an attempt to defend the decision to publish it in the journal Social Text. But Sokal and another physicist, Jean Bricmont, actually wrote a book afterwards, after the Sokal hoax. They wrote a book called Intellectual Impostures, which is a collection of essays on the misuse of science and mathematics by leading postmodernist and feminist scholars. And I got a copy of it, and it's extraordinary. I was mainly interested in it from the point of view of mathematics, in which I have some claim to expertise. And
Of course, yes.
and there were the most extraordinary misuse of mathematics by these leading scholars, and I could list some of them for you. Two of them were major feminist scholars. One of them was Julia Kristeva, who is French-based, and another was Lucia Irigaray. And then there were others. There were the postmodernists, Jacques Lacan and Latour and Deleuze and others. And the way they used mathematics was simply utterly false. And the whole idea was to give some kind of veneer of extra credibility,
yeah,
polish, to what was, essentially vapid, vaporizings, fantastical theories of their own. And they got these things were being published in supposedly reputable journals. And this is what's going on. Unfortunately, and yet it still continues. And despite the attempts of people like Sokal and others to point to the nonsense that is being written, we still have this many gender studies departments in worldwide, and it seems that it's impenetrable. It's close to any kind of criticism. It just continues on with a momentum of its own. It's quite extraordinary,
It is. Well, one of the things that I've always found really frustrating and annoying, like of course I have problems with anti-science and I have problems with ideology and all of that, but what really gets my goat is hypocrisy.
Yeah.
So I'm in a scientific field, which is actually quite gender egalitarian. It's chemistry, but within chemistry, the more physical or mathematical leaning parts are more male dominated. So you get like articles from gender scholars and all these kind of people, pointing out how this is because of sexism or patriarchy or boys club or whatever.
Yeah.
Physics, maths, not so much maths anymore, but physics, engineering, computer science, physical chemistry, all of these disciplines tend to get lumped in as, they're holding women back and so on. And then it's like, okay, but your department is 100% female or 99% female, producing 99% female works and based on 99% female scholars' work. And yet you guys are exempt from that criticism.
That's
so
right.
You're apparently not sexist while having worse gender non-uniformity or uniformity, than any of the sciences has.
Yeah.
But it's okay when you do it. So it's this do as I say, not as I do attitude. That
right.
It just drives me crazy. It's the same with the National Women's Council. You can't be what you can't see. And then they're
Really?
90%. Yeah. So you can't have good decision. We want to ensure good decision making by having diversity. The implication being, of course, that you have 90% male, for example, then you won't make good decisions. But of course, their entire board is just made up of women.
That's right.
So apparently you can have perfect decision making and clarity when you're all female. But if you're not even all, but majority male, then you're going to have a problem. So I just think, be the change you want to see in the world. Don't just tell me to do something that you're not willing to do for yourself. I think that's a fair standard to hold anyone to.
Yeah.
And I'm including even these so-called academics and activists and egalitarians that they claim to be.
That's right.
Although, just to finish up, because I think we should finish up soon.
Yeah.
An amusing anecdote from Trinity. Recently, we have a gender equality society here. It's called the Gender Equality Society.
Right.
Which I think is a fine name. But recently they were quite irate because they failed to get, at the society meeting that happens every year, they failed to get a quorum, which they need to have by the constitution of the college or by the society's constitution, to change the name from the Gender Equality Society to, can you guess what they're going to change it to?
No.
I'm sure you can. The Feminist Society. So they want to change the name from being "We're about gender equality," which to me I think is fine name, and
Yeah.
I think it makes sense, to being just the feminist society. So on the one hand, I have to kind of congratulate them for not just pretending anymore,
Yeah.
pretending that they're not just an ideological society. But on the other, it's like a joke that at first I thought it was in the satirical magazine, which actually I don't even think it exists anymore. But it's actually a real thing that happened here. So I don't know. I have mixed feelings about that development. So, but I think
Yeah.
that's the name.
Yeah.
Like whatever they call
Yeah.
themselves, they are just ideologues at the end of the day.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and it exposes the whole claim to be in favor of equality. It exposes it as a complete sham, because now they want to change the name of the previous name, which was gender equality, to feminism.
Yeah. So
It just exposes the sham nature of the whole enterprise. It's not about equality at all. These people want supremacy.
well, yeah, it's about equality. Well, the thing is how they ideologically define equality. Because if you really do believe that we live in an oppressive patriarchy, then they would kind of view themselves as fighting the system, and to get equality, they need to step up to the same level as the oppressors, right? Whereas, of course, most people would just look at it and say, no, you're probably equal here, 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 and here, and here's examples of where you're actually doing better
That's right.
in many areas, and that's kind of our job to point out.
Yeah.
But that's like, oh, that's just kind of ignored. So it's going to keep kind of iterating onto smaller and smaller types of oppression until I wish I could say with any confidence that it would be kind of burn itself out, but I think it's just too invested.
Yeah.
Another thing that we haven't touched on at all, and we probably could do a whole podcast on, is you have to also follow the money.
Yeah.
You're not going to, as I said before multiple times, you're not going to find people advocating that there's no more sexism now, guys. We can all go home and get real jobs.
Yeah.
Solve the problem. I think it was Gloria Steinem who was asked, I think it was in 2012, how things have improved since the 70s, when she was in her heyday.
Yeah.
And I think she said it's actually getting worse. Women are even more oppressed today.
Yeah.
There's more ways to do oppression in this modern world than there were.
It's purely about keeping the money rolling into them.
To me, it has to be, because that's also what they did when Warren Farrell started going off the script. Because they were very good friends, Gloria Steinem and Warren Farrell. They were not just cohorts in the fight for feminism. They were actually personal friends. And when he started talking about things like getting dads more involved in the home and looking at things from the male perspective as well, the first thing they did was attempt to go after his money, to stop giving him speaking engagements, workshops, because they knew that without money, that's it. You need to be in the fold. So in a way, people could be angry about this from a kind of a taxpayer point of view rather than from an ideological one. These people are taking your money. They're not giving you anything in return. They're not producing good quality scientific work that you could be proud of and stand over as a society. So maybe on that ground, you should think about protesting it.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So that would be it. We've kind of rambled on there now for a while, so I think we can probably finish this up.
Right.
And next podcast will be in 2 weeks' time, as usual. We haven't decided the subject yet, but we can talk about it.
Yeah.
Or you can tell us what you'd like to see. And other than that, I guess thank you for listening. Oh, and our website is nearly finished being fully updated. Wouldn't you say, David?
It has a bit to go yet, but
a little bit to go.
Yeah,
you can look forward to a much more user-friendly and modern website with, I guess we'll be putting more content on it when we have it ready to go. That's kind of more suited to, reading short pieces and blog posts and things like that and short videos. So I think I've been saying this for weeks now that, that's all coming in the future, but it really is, in the next couple of months, really going to start to finally materialize. So look forward to that. Make sure you share our video around and like us and all that stuff on social media. And if you feel so inclined, you can go onto the website, go to our donations page, give us a few quid, because we do it for free. We don't get any funding and so on. And yeah, thank you very much for listening. And we will talk to you very soon.